Hey y'all, it's the beginning of your upkeep, so it's time for another episode of Recurring Insight. I'm your host Michael, and let's dive in. This week's video takes a look at the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty set and breaks down the cards most likely to see play in cEDH. We then compare them with similar viable cards to determine if they're really worth it. Without further ado, let's get into it. To start, let's look at the new generals this set brings. These ones don't really have too many good direct comparisons, but I'll do my best. Let's start with Hinata, Dawn Crowned. This spirit reduces the cost of spells you cast with targets and increases the cost for your opponents. The main categories of spells that care about targets are removal and stack interaction. This creates a situation where you are more capable of interacting than anyone else in the pod, which comes with pros and cons. It's obviously a benefit to tax spells targeting permanents or spells you control, but this could serve as a Teferi Time Raveler on a smaller scale, preventing your opponents from stopping each other from winning. If you try to 1v3 the pod, you're going to be in a poor position, so you will need to rely on them, and although you can hope they'll play around it, it is a point to consider. Hinata is still a net benefit for you, but it does come with drawbacks. It also comes with the issues inherent to any commander that cheats on mana. The cards best able to capitalize on it are often dead or poor cards if Hinata is in the command zone. For example, Hinata turns Aurelia's Fury into a 2-mana silence effect that also pings all creatures for 1 and taps them with the ability to put more mana into it to finish off larger creatures. However, Aurelia's Fury is not a strong card by itself. I couldn't find too many that were viable without Hinata, so for the most part, it's not abusable. I want to be clear though, it is a very potent effect. It also has synergy with Recursion, which in these colors is typically pricey. The best win con for it would be the Breach combo. LED or Lotus Petal generates mana and can be repeatedly recast because Wheel of Fortune or Brain Freeze will mill the cards to pay for the escape cost. If you assemble it with the Intuition pile of Breach, LED, and Savine's Reclamation, Hinata can also reduce the cost of Reclamation. It's not game-changing, but it's something. If you're interested in hearing more about the Breach combo, check out the dedicated guide in the top right. The next best would be the Dualcaster Mage combo. Twin Flame and Heat Shimmer are reduced to 1 and 2 mana respectively by Hinata, which is a bonus. The closest comparison would be Grand Arbiter. I prefer Grand Arbiter's abilities personally. The tax hits all of your opponent's spells, and you only need to pay full price for colorless spells. There aren't really any good colorless spells hit by Hinata either though. Increasing the tax and cost reduction amount per target is the only pro that Hinata's abilities have over Grand Arbiter's, and there are only a few viable cards that can take advantage of it. The only point I would say Hinata has over Grand Arbiter is that it has access to red, which honestly is enough. Hinata gets access to Breach while Grand Arbiter, like many Azorius decks, doesn't have access to too many good win conditions. Hinata will be more viable than Grand Arbiter, but not by much. This was the first legendary creature I saw from the set, and my opinion hasn't changed from when I first saw it. Seitoro allows you to pay 4 mana and return an unblocked creature to put any creature onto the field from your hand. If you want to trade your Ornithopter for Jin-Gitaxias, you got it. Do you want to trade your Changeling Outcast in? 4 mana gets you Villas. This deck can play bombs better than any other deck in cEDH. Reanimator decks can't run the same density since they need to put the card in the yard and need reanimation. Seitoru, however, lets you just replay the evasive creature and get another trigger on the next turn, so you can run a decent density of powerful creatures. You also get to draw the best of your top 3 cards whenever you activate a ninjutsu ability, which is just icing on the cake. Thoracle would be the best win con for this deck. It's the best win con in just about any deck that can run it though, so that's boring. On a less lame note, Seitoru can cheat Razaketh out for 4 mana. This deck can play small creatures with evasion as fodder for the ninjutsu trigger and as fodder for Razaketh once he hits the field. It is a more expensive setup than reanimating Razaketh, but you also don't need to dilute your deck with reanimation. There are lines that go infinite by repeatedly using Seitoru's ability to cheat creatures out, but they require at least 4 lands to go infinite and 5 lands to generate infinite mana. Unfortunately, since Seitoru's triggered ability only triggers once each turn, you need another piece. It can either win off of ETB triggers, be a creature with an ETB, or be an infinite mana outlet. Honestly, the closest comparison would be Kaalia. Satoru requires 4 mana and an unblocked creature, while Kaalia just needs to swing. You'll rarely be able to cast either commander and cheat Razaketh into play on the same turn, but Satoru does come down a turn earlier, so it gets a point for speed, even though you do need to put more work in to get the trigger. Satoru's first ability is a bonus and the nail in Kaalia's coffin, since the deck will be able to grind better in addition to being faster. Keep in mind that Kaalia doesn't have blue, which is an upgrade in and of itself. All things considered, Satoru is significantly better than Kaalia and absolutely has a place in cEDH. Tameshi is not only a draw engine, but recursion as well. He can produce a lot of value and bring back key pieces. If you've ever wondered what having a fish the whole game would be like, wonder no more. For the low price of a blue, a white, and returning a land to your hand, you too can experience the fish's glory for as long as you would like. His first ability only triggers once each turn, but it makes your bounce spells cantrip. He lends himself well to a stacks plan since you can keep bringing your pieces back when they get removed. Unfortunately, the best way to win with him is at odds with that game plan. He isn't part of any good combos himself, but he is an outlet for Hullbreaker Horror. His first ability only triggers once each turn, but you can bounce and replay him as a new object in order to get the trigger as many times as you like. The polymorph route cuts us off from creatures and rule of law effects, which means the deck can't be played as a true stacks deck, but more of a tempo deck with silver bullets, or a deck that relies on bounce spells to fuel the hand and control the board. I can't think of any other finishers on a comparable level in this deck. Tameshi doesn't really have a good counterpart since both abilities are so relevant. Also, it's not so much a question of if he'll be viable, and more of a question of how far will that viability extend. As a result, I think it's better to look at other commanders that have similar strategies. The first one that comes to mind is Urza. They both run polymorph effects to win with Hullbreaker and have a stacksy game plan that isn't true stacks. Urza, however, can create massive amounts of mana by turning artifacts into mana rocks and is an infinite mana outlet. This gives him access to more combos, including the Power Artifact and Dramatic Scepter combos. He also has amazing synergy with the Orbs and Trinisphere. Tameshi is restricted to the polymorph lines and lacks the explosive potential of Urza. Instead, he's a value engine, drawing cards as well as returning artifacts and enchantments to the field. He also costs 1 less than Urza, so you can get him out and working earlier. In total, I don't think he's more powerful than Urza, but he does have certain advantages that let him grind better. Let's move on to the Jellyfish. I love the design of this card so much, and I don't know why. By himself, he lets you look at the top card of your library. This makes cards like Thought Scour and the fetches significantly better. It's after you reconfigure the chip that things get really spicy though, because then you can start casting from the top of your library. It now serves as a source of variable card advantage. You could end up playing 5 cards from the top, or you could end up with 2 lands. Since the land base makes up less than a third of the deck for most cEDH decks though, you can rely on generating card advantage from it. The best win con for the chip is Sensei's Divining Top and a cost reducer, ideally Ethereum Sculptor so you can reconfigure the reality chip onto it, but any will do as long as there's a creature on the field. You can flop top, cast top from the top for free, and repeat. The pieces for this combo are all artifacts, so there are a decent amount of tutor options. Next up is the Basalt Monolith and Mesmeric Orb combo. You can tap Basalt Monolith for 3 mana and immediately pay to untap it, which triggers Mesmeric Orb. Since each trigger only mills 1 card, you've got complete control over which cards get milled and which get cast. This means that if you've got Thoracle in your deck, you can mill the Thoracle, cast Thoracle, and mill the rest of your library in response to the trigger. This is technically a 3-card combo, but you only need Basalt Monolith, Mesmeric Orb, and a creature for the reality chip to attach to on the field. Finally, Thoughtlash comes in last. This works the same way as the Mesmeric Orb combo. Unfortunately, blue can't really tutor for Thoughtlash. The chip can churn through your deck to help offset this, but not being able to search for it hurts a lot and is the reason it's 3rd best, even though it is a better combo than the Orb one. The closest comparison would be Elsha. The chip is cheaper, but in order to cast spells from the top of your library, you need 3 mana to reconfigure it and another creature to attach it to. I prefer the play pattern of the chip. Being able to pay for it in installments allows you more flexibility in the early game. If the chip didn't require another creature on the field, I'd 100% say it's better, but that's not the case. Between the additional requirement and losing access to red and white, Elsha is definitely the stronger option. However, it's close enough that the chip will still be viable. Now that we've looked at the commanders, let's take a look at the cards auditioning for the 99, starting with the removal. First up is the best removal to have been printed since Assassin's Trophy. This version of Bosiju can either serve as a land or removal for artifacts, enchantments, and non-basic lands. The non-basic land clause typically won't see much play, but it's nice to have. It costs only 1 and a green unless you have your commander out, in which case it clocks in at just 1 green. Unlike the closest comparable card, Nature's Claim, you can't counter this, since it's an ability. This also means it dodges rule of law effects. This is definitely a staple, good enough to be an auto-include in every deck with green. March of Swirling Mist is in kind of a weird position. It serves as temporary removal that can scale. I think the closest comparison that currently sees play would be Cyclonic Rift. Rift has seen a decrease in play since the release of Dockside, since it couldn't be used to return it to hand. This can hit your own Dockside, but phasing in wouldn't trigger as ETB. You can use it to protect your creatures, but it's definitely not the primary purpose. March of Swirling Mist is more versatile than Rift, which can be played as single target removal for 2 mana or a board wipe for 7 mana, with no in between. March lets you pay for each target, and the cost can be reduced by exiling blue cards from your hand. This is really the selling point for the card. It can hit a lot of creatures for not a lot of mana. Unfortunately, it can only hit creatures. If it could hit non-land permanents, I would be a lot more confident in this seeing play. As it stands, it's narrow and better at stopping combos or clearing the board of stacks pieces to go for the win. I think March of Swirling Mist will be, at best, a niche card for controlling decks that rely too heavily on creatures to run the better board wipes, or don't have access to the better board wipes. Moonsnare Prototype has Channel as well, but the ability is significantly more expensive. If you have a cheap commander, you can tap it for mana, or, if you draw it later in the game, you can bin it to remove something. This is essentially a backwards Springleaf Drum. You pay colored for it and get colorless out of it. It's an unfortunate downgrade which makes it feel a little clunky, but it still ramps for 1 mana and is versatile. It doesn't go in every deck, especially not green decks, since they have dorks, but if you're running Springleaf Drum, you'll likely want this as well. Odawara is more balanced. It doesn't have Moonsnare Prototype's hefty price tag, but it's not as broke as Bosiju. It's able to hit creatures and planeswalkers as well, but it bounces instead of removing. This places it firmly beneath Bosiju. Partner commanders get to take advantage of the additional discount to turn this into a normal 2 mana bounce spell. This likely won't make it into decks helmed by more expensive generals, but unless the land base has already been stretched to the limit, this is a very low opportunity cost. It'll reach staple status because of it. None of the stack interaction was good enough to seriously consider, let alone include. There was one piece of card draw I thought worth talking about. Just like with the other March, I'm not sure if this one will actually see play, but I much prefer this one. This one doesn't really have a great comparison. Although you're limited to only playing 2 cards, you can choose how deep you want to dig. It is Impulse Draw, but you get 2 cards for 3 mana at instant speed, and you get until the end of your next turn to play the cards. What sets it apart though is that you can reduce the cost by exiling red cards from your hand, letting you pitch bad cards to improve the quality of the 2 cards you get. As decks get access to more colors, there will be a natural decrease in the density of each individual color, especially with red. For that reason, it'll be restricted to decks with 2 or less colors. There weren't any good new tutors, but that's not really a huge surprise. Since I don't think Inventive Iteration will see play, there aren't any stacks pieces either. The Recursion got something new though. It's not the best, or even very good, but it's low opportunity cost. You can pay 4, or, if you've got a relatively cheap commander, 3, to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. I put it in the same category as Academy Runes and Hall of Heliod's Generosity, but worse, since you can't use and play it. However, it's basically a swamp with upside, so you don't have to worry about it only producing colorless mana. You also get to return it to hand instead of needing to draw into it like the others. It'll likely make it into decks with 3 or less colors that don't run something like Back to Basics or Blood Moon that incentivizes playing basic lands. Containment Construct lets you play any cards that you discarded this turn, so it's sort of recursion. It's niche, but it works excellent in the decks that care about discard. The closest comparison is Conspiracy Theorist, but they each have their pros and cons. Construct is colorless, which opens it up to more decks, although that's not really a big factor, since most of the decks that want this have access to red. It also doesn't do anything on its own, while Theorist can loot when it attacks. However, Construct will also let you play all of the cards you discard, even if you discard them all at once. This makes it work a lot better with Necropotence. Onto the ramp, we've got Moonsnare Prototype, which I talked about earlier. Drumbellower is essentially Seedborn Muse Light. The 2-mana difference causes you to miss out on untapping your artifacts and lands, which was honestly the most powerful part of Seedborn Muse. Dropping that will cause this to not benefit as many decks, but the lowered mana cost will make it more playable in the decks that do want it. The decks that want it are green decks, specifically the Dork decks, not the ones like Tasigur that drop them in favor of artifacts. However, it'll be restricted to blue decks or decks with commanders that either have tap abilities or can serve as a mana sink in order to best take advantage of it. Then we've got Enthusiastic Mechanaut, which is a cost reducer for artifacts. It's basically a Therium Sculptor with a more restrictive color cost. It'll likely only make it into decks on the Sensei's Divining Top combo. This one doesn't really fit into any of the other sections, so I'm just tossing it in at the end here. However, I think this is one of the more powerful cards from the set. It's similar to Phantasmal Image with some key differences. To start, Imposter Mech isn't a creature. This makes it easier to interact with on the stack, but you don't have to sack it when it becomes the target of a spell or ability like Phantasmal Image. It not being a creature doesn't really affect the functionality of it for most targets in the meta. It can't hit your own creatures, which is the only major drawback. However, you've still got the creatures of the other 3 players to target. Unless you're specifically running Image for your own creatures, I would normally prefer Imposter Mech. And there we go. That wraps up the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty set review. In total, I like it. There are a lot of interesting new cards for the meta without anything too broken. I'm personally eyeing up Tameshi. My only complaint is with Bosiju and Otawara. Stax has enough to deal with in cEDH, and these just make its job harder. I don't normally play Stax, and I'm definitely going to run them when I can, but they're not going to have a healthy effect on the meta. I don't think the impact will be overwhelmingly severe, but it will be significant. Next week's video will be a deck tech video that compares 3 5-color commanders. If you liked the video or found it helpful, feel free to drop a like and hit that subscribe button. My socials are linked in the description, and I run polls on Twitter to determine the topics of future videos. I really appreciate you all taking the time to watch. I'm your host Michael, and I'll see you at the beginning of your next upkeep for another episode of Recurring Insight.